Okay, welcome everyone. I'm excited to have Colonel Stephen Totter on with us today. Now, if you remember from episodes ago, Colonel Totter was with us earlier on. I would say, probably within the first 10 episodes. And I'm going to have him on again today for our conversation about whether the world should be policed by the United States. Thanks, Steve, for coming on.
You got it, John.
This is going to be great. So as you know, well, let me first make sure I show everybody my t-shirt for Thanksgiving, right? This is going to come out the night before Thanksgiving, and this is my stupid pour some gravy on me t-shirt. So got to keep it light, even though we're talking about the world's problems. But From last episode, as you know, we were talking about whether the U.S. can maintain its status globally, given the situations that are happening, the geopolitical situations that are happening across the world. So, and I broke that out into this new axis of evil, these four powers: North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia, that are working together, kind of. But you'll have to go back, listen to part one to really understand the foundation of the conversation. And as I said at the end, what I wanted to do was part two, because I think these two topics relate, and that is whether the U.S. should be involved in doing any of this stuff really anyways. Kind of this isolationist view, vice supporting, the regional, or not even regional, but global security posture that exists today, and I would argue exists since post-World War II. And not only is Colonel Totter a great guest anyways, and we have these wonderful conversations, but he and I have gone back and forth on this topic, and he has some interesting and really valuable perspectives that are aligned with mine at times, but then oftentimes they're not. So I said, listen, let's just talk about this, and I think it'll be a lot more useful than me just blabbering into the mic for an episode. Let's make it a bit more interesting. So I'm glad that you're here, and hopefully it gets like really heated and we start throwing virtual punches, because I think that'll be fun. Maybe not. It won't be for me because I'll lose. But anyways, okay, so here's my thought, really. The United States, I think it's inarguable. Maybe you would want to argue, and then we'll just start right off with that. But it's inarguable that, in my opinion, that the United States is the lone global superpower. After the fall of the wall in 91, it can be argued that China is up and coming. It's on its way. You could point out some facts about their economic growth, the percent of their GDP. At times, I think, if I recall correctly, a few years ago, it might have even peaked and crossed. It took over the United States, if you will, as the number one size of the economy globally, and then kind of fell back underneath the U.S., but nonetheless, it's growing exponentially. Their military is growing, but I would still argue the United States sits alone as the lone superpower, both economically and militarily. And again, I would also argue that the generalized stability that the globe has seen since the end of World War II, and when I say generalized security, meaning there has been no World War III, even though there were two world wars in the span of like 40 years, is in part due to the United States taking over a larger role and breaking out of its isolationist shell, if you will, that really seemed to be our goal in the first half of the 20th century. And the world has really prospered. Is that, as a result, is that something on a general standpoint you would even agree with? Is that something that is that an opinion you hold, or am I off on that?
No, I think a lot of that resonates with me. I think I would agree that the U.S. is the only superpower, probably for, I would say at least, the next decade or so, probably will continue to be the only superpower on the scene that's doing the things that we're doing. I would pick at some parts of that probably and say the fact that we haven't had another world war is largely due to the fact that now nuclear weapons are in play. I think that has probably staved off a lot of what we could have seen develop in terms of a world war in the future. All the major players have nuclear weapons, so I think that has contributed in large part to it. Now, if we're just going strictly off, have atrocities decreased, on the whole, as opposed to a world war. Yeah, I would probably agree with that too. Generally speaking, when you have major players, uh, at arms against each other, you're going to see a lot more in terms of bloodshed. So, so yeah, I think I'd agree with large chunks of what you said.
And would you directly attribute that to the United States, um, and its desire to put itself in a position to build a framework and maintain that security posture, or do you think it just happens to be, maybe technological growth, just kind of the happenstance of post World War II, a post World War II world, or do you think the U.S. really had an active role in that?
Yeah, I think that the U.S. did have an active role in that. I think it's obviously too in our best interest not to have another world war. I think when you look at the situation as a whole, though, I would attribute it more to the fact that the major players have nuclear weapons than an intentional strategy by the U.S. to prevent another world war from happening. Because we've gotten pretty close a couple of times, and I think probably what kept us back from the brink was the threat of nuclear war. If I could attribute that to anything, yeah. So I think I'd still largely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it's funny. You were one of the first to really get me to take a step back and have think deeply about that opinion in terms of nuclear weapons and if that's actually created a more peaceful environment, at least globally. And I think you're right. I think it just only makes sense that if we're to look at this rationally, no one really wants ultimate devastation from nuclear war. At least the vast majority of humans don't. No one has really demonstrated yet that that's not true, right? No one's
Yeah.
fired any nuclear weapons outside of the end of World War II in Japan, as we all know too well. But and I think you're right. I think the fact that it's even here, no one wants to cross that precipice. And again, let's say cross that precipice again. But and it's that point that leads me to often assess when people ask about Putin's rhetoric in terms of today's battle with Ukraine, when he talks about, firing nuclear weapons, even if they're on the tactical level. And my answer is often just no. The answer is no. No, because Putin is ultimately a rational actor. He's not insane. He certainly views the world through a different lens than we do. He has every right to do that. When I say we, I mean the United States. And he views his position, his responsibilities, they're all very different than ours. But it doesn't mean he's crazy, clearly.
Yeah.
And he's not interested in shooting nuclear weapons at anyone because that invites the potential that someone would shoot it back, the United States being the lead in that. And then where does that get anyone? No one, right? I think Putin's probably in the same position, or likely in the same position as any U.S. president would be, and that is if a president felt like the United States was in an existential crisis, if it was possible the United States would no longer exist, meaning we would be completely defeated on the battle space and someone else was going to take us over, I think the president would step in and use nuclear weapons if he or she felt the need.
Yeah.
In order to stop that from happening, right? I think Putin's in the same boat. He's not shooting nuclear weapons because, somebody came into Russian territory and took 10 kilometers from their western border, right? That's just
Right.
not going to happen. So, all right, so this is fun already. We're just all on the same boat, or we're all on the same opinion. So, thanks, Steve. No. But let's get into a couple of the other things. So let me say it this way. There are some general opinions, general points that are made in terms of the U.S. policing the rest of the world that are really just often repeated by foreign policy experts. I am not one. Foreign policy experts, geopolitical strategists. They're pretty universal. And I've done a lot of reading on this. I know Steve has as well. And then there's the, kind of universal opinions that really argue against it. And I think there's a lot of value in all of them. I really haven't found, again, in at least in what I've read, that there's any common, like, nonsensical opinions. You can find that oftentimes in geopolitics. Really, you can find it in any aspect of the world. But you can find in arguments that there's just opinions that just seem silly and not even worthy of being part of the debate. But I don't see that as the case again, at least when it comes to the general opinion. So let me first say, I think one of the examples I think that demonstrates what you and I opened the show with, and that is the U.S. stepping in at the end of World War II, that demonstrates the positive effects that came from the U.S. stepping in. It was the Marshall Plan, was the fact that the United States felt that it had an ethical, moral, and economic responsibility to rebuild Europe after World War II. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan stepped in. We loaned a whole bunch of money to Europe, which was completely devastated at the end of 45. And it not only rebuilt Europe for its own sake, but reestablished, or I should say, reestablished a security presence or a security posture for Europe, and then added the United States into like the, into the global security manager. And I think those two doctrines and that major movement, that massive loans over and over to Europe, I think is the best example to support the argument. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's definitely the strongest side of the spectrum, right? You got on the one hand, probably an extreme example of interventionism would be the U.S. being willing to step in every single conflict. We have a hand in it, right? And we're willing to step in at the slightest drop of a hat. Everything is our business, right? That's the one end of the extreme. At the other end of the extreme is like isolationism, like true isolationism. Think like Japan, prior to the 1930s and 40s, right? Just like a closed country, no engagement. So, the Marshall Plan being somewhere on that spectrum, right? Economic cooperation in exchange for, certain security arrangements with the rest of the world. And that's more to the end of interventionism that I, think that there's some real value there, right? Protecting trade relationships, protecting the free commerce of trade. So there's some things there that I would even see as having value. I'm a recovering libertarian myself, so I have heard plenty of arguments that like we should be nowhere in the world at any given time, and we have to withdraw from every single country, and those have less weight with me now than they used to. But yeah, sure, I think it's in America's interest in some cases to create security arrangements with other countries. I think you don't have to be a rabid interventionist to say that that's a good thing.
Yeah, I got two questions I want to ask. And let me ask the first one. And then the second one I want to ask, I think is going to get us closer to maybe a potential back and forth. So the first one
Sure.
is, could you envision, if we had some revisionist history time here, could you see what might have happened if we didn't have a doctrine like the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, end of 45? Let's say the United States just curled back up and said, hey, you're welcome, Europe. We helped, let's say, I don't want to be too biased here. We helped Europe push Hitler back out and whatever. Let's just go back into our cocoon. One would assume Stalin and the Soviet Union would have been even more powerful than they were. Do you see a potential situation globally now where we would be more unstable if we didn't do that?
Well, the fear with that would be that obviously communism would have stepped into the gap, right, and would have filled that power vacuum, and they certainly did in a lot of cases where we even, allowed, Stalin to come into certain countries in a certain sense, right, and the way that we broke down things after World War II, and really didn't start to step up like a policy of containment until years after the end of World War II in a very serious way. So, we could certainly count on a little bit more expansion of communism, but what would have stepped into the gap in Europe is a little bit of a question mark for me, because we really did also curtail a lot of the imperialist powers of France and England at the time too, at the same time that we stepped into that gap, right? We told Britain, for all intents and purposes, you can't really have an empire the same way you did before because democracy is in. Democracy is the way to go for the future. So, Great Britain had to slowly, under our guidance and under our protection, kind of curtail some of its empire back. So at the end of the day, would we have seen just communism full blown spread across, Europe? I'm not too certain, especially once nuclear weapons entered the picture. Maybe we would have seen even a more robust Western European continent. I don't know. Was France and Britain strong enough to do that at the time? Maybe not on their own, right? So,
Mm.
there's a little bit of a question mark for me as to whether, the USSR would have just gone unabated for that period of time, and whether maybe we could have seen something along the lines of just a stronger Western Europe step into the gap.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. I mean, I hate to be the Vietnam Republican, the Vietnam era Republican, and look at what happened when we didn't step in, or let's say that differently, when we ended up losing in Vietnam, and if we didn't step into Korea, we could have lost the entire peninsula. And I know it's revisionist, and who knows what really would have happened, but nonetheless, I also get the point that, just because the United States wasn't involved doesn't mean all chaos would reign either, right? That would be biased. But so let me go to my second question, and that is, what is it that led you to being a recovering libertarian? Why did you change your stance, and when did that happen?
Yeah, so I guess gradually over time, when you first step into politics, I think idealism is probably like one of the more forefront things in your mind. I know that when we discussed this during our previous episode about the Iraq War, that in my childhood and into my teenage years, I was a huge proponent of the Iraq War. I thought that was great, mostly because that's what I was exposed to. Was this these guys are bad. 9/11 was terrible. We need to go after these guys as radical Islamic extremism. So then the pendulum kind of swung the other way, especially after my deployment to Iraq, and I was like, wow, there's just so much of this that doesn't match up with what I'm seeing. And there's certainly a robust political philosophy behind libertarianism that comes and fills in that gap and explains, well, okay, every single intervention is terrible, and the government intervening in any way in all these aspects of life just shows, horrible consequences. But there is an idealism to that too that I don't necessarily see played out when you look at the reality on the ground. Because oftentimes you'll encounter this when talking to communists, is they'll say, well, real communism hasn't been tried, right? This is why it hasn't worked, right? It would work if we just got these things right.
Sure.
There's an element of that to neoconservatism too, where they say, well, this intervention would have worked, right? We would have been able to figure out Iraq if we had just thrown 100,000 more troops into the situation, right? And we even went over that argument last time we had the podcast, like, well, what would have happened if we did this or did that? And so every intervention is just the answer to why it didn't work was, well, we just didn't go hard enough. We should have just gone, this much harder, and it would have worked. And that's true of libertarianism too. It's like, this idea that, well, real libertarianism has never been tried. We've never really done that before. And it just doesn't hold a ton of weight for me. And at the end of the day, when looking at the world as a whole, I'm not convinced that if the U.S. was just to take a big step back in every single way, that would equal a good outcome for us. Especially just being, you start to refine what's most important to you, right? Is it freedom? Is it security? And I think as you get older and you start caring about, the next generation and even the generation beyond that, you start to value order and security a little bit more too, in addition to freedom. And where's that right balance? And for me, the idea that if we withdrew from every corner of the world, it would somehow create a utopia of some sort, and we wouldn't see, more bloodshed is just not obvious to me anymore.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people argue that, against the point that if communism was just tried in a perfect way, right, if it had the environment to flourish in the way it was written, then it would be just fine, right? But I think a lot of historians, or I shouldn't say I think, I do know a lot of historians now look at it and say, well, the idea is fundamentally flawed, and that's why it doesn't ever work. And, because there's a human element involved, and there's, humans will always be, they will always be greedy to some extent. They will always be independent to some extent. And so when you have these balances of human desires versus the socialist/communist ideal, it just doesn't work, right? Yeah. And you can look at what capitalism does and say, well, sure, there's plenty of evils in capitalism, but it has a better framework to try and work within the realities of human nature, and therefore we flourish economically. But do you see as you had said in your last point, it's not obvious to you that neoconservatism, conservatism, and intervention like we did in Iraq would have worked, and maybe never would work. Do you see it in the same way? I guess, meaning, is there a time and a place where an intervention based on a conservative Republican ideal would work, or is it simply fundamentally flawed like communism and would never work?
Yeah, I think universalizing the principle of democracy is one of the key features that you see in neoconservatism, right? Is that democracy is not only good for us, it's not only good for us, for all time, but it's good for everybody. And everybody is just going to pick up this idea, and all we have to do is depose dictators, and democracy will flourish in that country with just a little bit of elbow grease. That idea is a key feature, and that in particular I find to be just untenable at this point, just given the evidence that we've seen over the years. Now, I won't apply that to every single intervention, right? There may be lots of reasons why we would intervene into a country other than to establish democracy. I can't think of any really good examples right now post World War II. I'm not even opposed to the doctrine of preemption. The idea that if
Right.
somebody was going to attack us, we had to attack first. I think that sounds reasonable to me. It didn't always, but now I would say there's good arguments for preemption as well. But when talking about what most interventions end up looking like, there's this universalizing principle of democracy is good for everybody, and all we need to do is kick down the door, and it's the whole edifice is going to fall, right? To quote what Germany was saying about USSR in World War II, and that is, I believe, thoroughly disproven at this point.
Do you hold the same opinion that Churchill did when he said all governments are awful, democracy is just the least awful of all of them?
Yeah, well, it's at least awful for us. I could say at least that much. Like in the United States, I can't imagine anything working too much better than what we have right now in terms of some mix of a republic with representative government and some mix of democracy. It seems to be pretty good. I haven't heard a really good replacement for that yet. Plenty of people suggest, should we get rid of the electoral college? Should we do this? Yeah, sure. There's good arguments, that I've heard from time to time. I definitely think it's the best thing that we've tried, and I'll
Sure.
even expand that probably to Western Europe. But is it good for all countries at all time? I couldn't say that. I couldn't say that it's a universal principle that this is the best way for everybody to govern their countries. And to be honest, it doesn't even seem like we believe that.
Right.
if we
Right.
look at the countries that we support,
Sure.
it's definitely not a universal principle for us that, well, we're only going to ally or associate or even, support a country if it has democratic values. I mean, that's simply not true.
Yeah.
Right. So, it doesn't seem like we even believe that.
Do you think in an ideal world, all things being equal, that at some point every culture and country would eventually reach a point where democracy is the best for them? Or are you one of the believers that says, are you just of the opinion that certain cultures and their histories just don't lend to a democratic ideal, and that maybe some type of dictatorial government or whatever is just better based on their history?
Yeah, I'm not sure where the line is.
Yeah.
Because there's clearly, I mean, you'll meet people from time to time that really could not care less whether they were under a democratic system or if they were ruled. You'll meet people like that who just have no interest whatsoever in self-government.
Yeah.
Right. You meet people like that even in the United States.
Sure.
So it's not obvious to me that, for 100% certainty, if you put it on a long enough timeline that, every country would arrive at that same conclusion. People are messy. They're very messy, right? And
Right.
cultures and the different carrots and sticks that are applied. That's probably one of the biggest lessons that you can learn from American interventions, is that we're not just little cogs in a machine and, you can just take one out and put another one in and everything's going to work out fine. People are just very different and, have different cultures and histories. And, that's something that we really have to take into consideration when we do an intervention, if we do an intervention. And that's probably one of the most valuable lessons that you can learn. Another thing is like the order in which you get through certain parts of philosophical history as a country, right? Like Japan got basically all the Enlightenment all at once.
Mm.
And it was like almost too much for them in the sense that it was too much change in too short a period of time. And they, many people attribute that to why they became fascist. Was just, they did not have the centuries of kind of working through the Enlightenment principles that the rest of the Western world did, for example. Theirs came a little bit out of order, a little bit suddenly. And, the argument's been made that maybe they weren't ready for that. So it's difficult to tell, if is that just an issue of, a long enough time horizon, and maybe they would be, this would be a good form of government for them. But you can make the same argument about the United States. Maybe we haven't found the best form of government, and just on a long enough timeline, we'll find something even better than what we have now. So in both cases, it doesn't strike me as like obvious that this is the best we will ever do for all of time, and that, for everybody else in the world, that's the same, as well.
Yeah, I can. That all makes a lot of sense to me. And even though I feel, I'm of the idealistic bent a little bit, meaning I understand the realities of different cultures and time frames and what may work for them isn't necessarily what will work for us now. Got it. I also happen to lean a little bit towards if a culture reached a certain point, and that's hard to say what that even means, right? Because it's not even just linear, but reached a certain age or experience or point, or however you want to describe it, that to me, representative government really can't be surpassed, right? I mean, what type of government would you rather have than one that you as a people choose? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm not arguing that a representative government is equally the best and ultimately going to survive forever. That isn't necessarily the case. I mean, China's been around with the same system of government prior to communism for millennia, right? It just was overlords, and so it clearly lasted a very long time. And here, we in the United States, we're working at 250 years, and maybe everything ends tomorrow. Who knows, right? But so again, I wouldn't say that both things are true, and that it's the best form of government, at least for those that are being represented, and it's again forever lasting. But I don't know if you need both. You know what I mean? Like, is it better to have, hey, let's have the good one, even if it doesn't last forever, as opposed to the kind of good one that lasts a very long time? I don't know. But
yeah, I guess a counterpoint to that would be something like Afghanistan, which, they didn't like the dog food, to use the expression, right? Like
sure.
they certainly had their exposure to democracy, right? And as a people, did not take to it the way that you would think if it was like a universalized principle. Now you could say, oh, well, we never really put it to a vote in it really was ended by the Taliban when they took back the country, and, they overrode the will of the people. But there certainly wasn't like a widespread uprising when the Taliban came back in the way that some people, especially neoconservatives, would have envisioned, if the country had, really taken to democracy in the way that they, thought it would, right? They certainly had their exposure to it. The elites in the society, were able to attend schools. It was, it didn't get out to, I'm sure, every corner of the countryside because of the way that culture is designed, but they were exposed to it, and still rejected it by and large. And, I'm not sure if you were able to put it to 100% free and fair vote today, whether they would, take a, Jeffersonian type democracy. That's not very obvious to me anyway.
Now, would you make the claim potentially that what didn't work in Afghanistan was due in part to the inability to fit democracy into every mold or cultural mold, or the fact that nationalism, the fact that we as humans have decided to create nation states for whatever political purposes that's come about, and not every nation we've created was probably the most intelligently created, right? So I guess what I'm
Yeah.
saying is, I'm trying to sound more complicated. I'm making this more complicated than it should be. What I'm saying is, Afghanistan's never really worked as a nation. So is it we were trying to impart democracy on a nation that shouldn't be a nation in the way we view nations today, or was it democracy just wasn't good for that culture? Maybe
Oh,
both.
that's a great question. I really don't know. You know, there's some like there's a huge ethos in that society about tribalism, right? And we have kind of this like visceral reaction to tribalism and say like, whoa, that's that's backward, and that's maybe you wouldn't say that, but a lot of people I think in the United States would say that that's backwards, but there's something real there, right? There's a connection there. There's a family and a loyalty there that matters to those people. And maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something that's stronger there than the ties that we feel because we've been exposed to the Enlightenment and the idea of the nation state and the idea of this principle that every member of the citizenry owes a loyalty, a patriotism to their wider country. But there was something there that was, I think, profoundly rejected, and that I would be unwilling to say is necessarily worse for them, right? That they never really developed into a full-fledged nation today. That necessarily means that those people who are largely living under tribal rule are less happy or less fulfilled. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. But there's certain packages that come with all this too, right? Like in order to get a democracy like the United States has, there's women's rights that are part of that, right? There's equal representation under the law. There's all these different things that come with that. That in order to have a society accept wholesale, there's a lot of things that those people in that country would have to give up at this point, right? In terms of their beliefs about religion and how the world works, and even basic things about science. So those are all part of the package that kind of comes with it. And can you piecemeal that out? Can they accept a nation state but still keep their ideas about what it means to be, part of a tribe? I don't know. Yeah, again, I fall back on it's not obvious to me that that's the case.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. I have like a story I like to tell when it comes to Afghanistan to try to highlight this a little bit. And the challenge is I can't tell all of the details, but nonetheless, it's. I remember working with somebody when I was there who, let's just say, spent a lot of time with local Afghans, particularly those in the south. So we're talking Helmand province in particular, sometimes in Kandahar, but often in Helmand. And this person had come back into where I was working and was trying to describe to myself and my teammates what the interactions were like between this gentleman and the people he was working with. And he was just trying to describe their everyday life, the communication he had with them, their knowledge of the world, their knowledge of their little village life. I mean, just everything you can imagine. And the way he described it was that the people, at least that he was working with, and he found it to be relatively universal across these two provinces, that they are a people with so little information as we see it in the West, so little knowledge that any idea that we would try to have a conversation with them about not only forget democracy, we're talking like the fact that a government exists and what a government is, and
Yeah.
how a government quote unquote controls or provides, or any of those things. And I want to make clear here, this is not me trying to make a point about the Afghan people are silly and uneducated
Of
and
course.
dumb and all these silly things, right? None of those things are that unserious things. I'm simply just saying that they had experienced their life in such a small world, in such a small place, that they didn't have the opportunity to experience anything else. That it seems to me it wouldn't matter if the United States brought in a type of government that was literally perfect, and if you showed up to the palace door every day, they give you $10,000 every day you showed up, right? Like some silly like utopian nonsense. That wouldn't work.
Yeah.
It's not something that could make it. So I don't, Afghanistan's a tough discussion. But let me segue into the Iraq conversation, which is a whole different animal, and I think will actually help bridge us into some of the pros and cons, if you will, about this whole world policing state. given our opinion here on Iraq. So let's cover again your opinion on, as we're just sitting here as two Joes on a podcast here, right? We're not speaking for the government or the military, any of those silly things. This is just us and our own personal opinion. What you believe was the right thing to do in terms of Iraq in 2003. Looking back at it now, good idea, bad idea.
Yeah, just would say in the strongest possible terms, bad idea. It's certainly on the scale of like, did this cause more or less human suffering? Believe that in the long run, it caused more human suffering. We didn't accomplish certainly what the initial goals were that we were kind of sold by the government in terms of removing weapons of mass destruction, right? And the weapons of mass destruction is a particularly strong incentive for the United States to intervene in a country because, once something like that gets out of the bag and, you go and deliver WMDs to a terrorist actor, that was very fresh on our minds after 9/11. And that was certainly like the main reason that was used to go into the country. But has been just a disaster, like a true disaster in so many ways. If you calculate it in the amount of money that was wasted, the amount of debt that was incurred, the amount of Iraqi lives, which certainly numbers anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million, the amount of people displaced, the amount of American soldiers who died, certainly in the two conflicts was significant. And then, if you add into that the amount of American soldiers who died, soldiers, airmen, Marines, service members who died as a result of, you could call them moral casualties, people who committed suicide and during those years due to post-traumatic stress or other things that were related to combat deployments, the amount of families that were broken up due to the number of deployments, and we could probably go on for hours just about the stories that we know of people who whose lives were disasters as a result of that. You just compound that probably times at least double because there's so many cases of that we don't even know about that the government doesn't keep records on. As if you look at it as a whole compared to what was the case, before we intervened. And that wasn't a good situation at all, right? We wouldn't say like if we were making a model country, certainly that we would have this kind of megalomaniac dictator of the country, right? Who was very, who was very bloodthirsty in many ways and who had attacked his own people and had, certainly his sons, it didn't look like we're going to set up a, Jeffersonian democracy after he died, right?
Yeah, I think that's an understatement, sure.
But, so you don't want to paint like a rosy picture, of what would have happened if we had kept him in there. But then even after that, right, look, after the actual war in Iraq, or what we could, kind of define as a war in Iraq, the second and third order effects, the chaos that it unleashed in the region, right? We're still dealing with terrorist actors in Iraq who weren't there and certainly weren't acting in the same way, before we invaded the country, the overflow into Syria, the strengthening of the Shiite state in Iran, the destabilization of the region, the human suffering from refugee flows from Syria and other countries. I mean, man, it's a hard argument for me to hear that, okay, this is better off. And even just a project of setting up a democracy in that country, I think if we took a real hard look at how that government is run and the levels of corruption in the country, if we saw that those same levels of corruption and indecency and, civilian casualties and just, a real mess in another country, we would say, that country was in pretty bad shape.
Yeah. So, okay. So I've said on the show before, I think it's pretty clear what my opinion is. And I don't think I would go as far as you would. I'm of the opinion that I don't know. And I know that's kind of a cop out, but, I was for intervention back in 2003. And I admittedly was not as in tune with foreign affairs and geopolitics, and I wasn't an adult as much as I am today. So I look at the world a little bit differently, and admittedly there were some really, really poor decisions made, and I could list out, as you have just done, very clearly and intelligently, what with clear eyes, what what the negatives are. But at the same time, and maybe this is a bit emotional and I should be more technical, but I look back at the life that so many millions of Iraqis lived under the brutal Saddam regime and think, how is it that no one else outside of that country before us decided to remove what was walking evil on the world stage, right? Just
Yeah.
remove him from that country. Now, putting aside the argument, which is, I know one of the arguments that comes up in the pros and cons of policing is, which country are you going to help? You can't help every single one. So I got that. And oftentimes the United States in particular chooses not to intervene in places where there are people who are equally or potentially even worse than Saddam Hussein. So why do we pat ourselves in the back when we do something like pull Saddam out? Got it. But that's not an argument the Iraqis are interested in hearing. It's their leader that they want to have removed. Not everyone, obviously. There's a patronage, and there are a lot of Sunnis that were just as evil as Sunni Arabs who were just as evil as Saddam and lived off the oil wealth and treated their fellow citizens like garbage. So, it's hard for me to boy, this is complicated, but it's hard for me to say that I can look at it just one way because there were so many Iraqis who suffered as a result of Saddam's intentional bad behavior. Whereas on the other hand, the United States made unintentional mistakes. And yes, not every American is perfect, and there was probably some profit to be made and all those things you want to talk about. But generally speaking, unintentional poor choices, which led to today's scenario, but were well intentioned. Would you agree?
Yeah, there's actually a great book by a former State Department guy, and I apologize, his name is escaping me, but the title of the book is "We Meant Well."
Yeah.
And there is something to that, though. Like, we're certainly, as a country, I don't think entered into that. Certainly not the American people like you and me, who even signed up, during that period of time. Certainly meant to do the right thing, and the mistakes that were made, I would say, were largely a matter of us having unintended consequences, right? As opposed to truly trying to do something malicious. But for that person on the ground, it may not matter all that much, right? If you were an Iraqi citizen who was getting by under Saddam, was not dying, but you happen to lose your whole family because some action that the United States took. But I think what the key kind of difference that I would make there is that once we intervene, we own that, right? This
Yeah.
is something that's bad in the world, something that is terrible that's happening, under Saddam prior to our invasion. But then we have to own, as American people and as our government and as, putting our stamp on it, the atrocities that happen after the fact. And some of that we don't own, like truly in a moral sense, because we did see bad actors arise who, have their own, moral culpability, right? ISIS of Iraq, for example, committed terrible atrocities, and that's on them. But we do own the broader conflict once we intervene. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. So let me ask that. Do you subscribe, and I don't mean necessarily literally, but do you subscribe in some way to the argument that, President Obama and President Bush created ISIS because if we didn't intervene in '03, Saddam held such a, uh, powerful sway over the Iraqi people, there's no way he would have came about. He being Zarqawi and then eventually Baghdadi.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't put it exactly that way because it almost sounds like there was intent behind it to create ISIS. So I wouldn't say that, we created in the same sense that a, woodworker creates an object, for example. But I would say one of the unintended consequences was undoubtedly the chaos that we saw from ISIS. For what it's worth, Iraq did have obviously terrible atrocities committed in the name of Saddam, but he did keep some of the more extremist elements in that country at bay, right? And you saw the same thing in Libya. You saw the same thing in Afghanistan. There was, a sense at which these dictators, although ostensibly they were, Muslim, but they truly acted in a more secular sense, right? I mean, this is a guy, Saddam. He kept a pretty short beard. He was wearing like a French beret half the time,
Yeah, I
right?
remember.
He's a little bit
Yeah.
of a character, but he was certainly not like a religious zealot, right? He had like Christians in his cabinet. This was not like a religious extremist that we were concerned the most about in the wake of September 11th, right? And this idea that there was going to be these extremist terrorists who couldn't be reasoned with, and they were going to commit atrocities all around the world. There's certainly, just by any measure today, far more of those people in the world today than there were before we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Followers of bin Laden, followers of ISIS as an ideology has greatly spread around the world and has popped up in now dozens of other countries that we never anticipated before. Which was something that bin Laden actually intended, right? He intended there to be kind of this global uprising of jihad. He was trying to create a U.S. intervention into Afghanistan to kind of have the same thing happen to us that happened to the Soviets. And in large ways, we ensure that he was successful in that. Not again by our intentions, but by just the second and third order effects of our good intentions.
So let me placate me for a minute and humor me and all those other things. Let me try to make this as simple as possible. And I do this often, and oftentimes I leave out the nuance and I get yelled at, but work with me here. Are you saying that then it's therefore better, the world is better, and the United States is in a more a higher moral position or ethical position if we let one evil entity keep another evil entity at bay? That's better than if one of these evil entities is removed and therefore the second becomes more powerful.
Yeah, I feel less comfortable saying absolutely better. I feel more comfortable saying better for us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's
but better,
to have
but
one
better for
person.
the Iraqi people.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't necessarily say absolutely. Although, there's some very well-spoken people who could advocate for the fact that maybe that they're not even better off after our intervention, under the chaos that's going on in the Middle East, and the amount of people who died. Right. If we're just
Right.
doing a one-to-one comparison of like, okay, well, what killed more people, leaving it alone or breaking it, right? There's a good argument to be made that just in terms of bloodshed, that it was better to leave it alone. But I'd say definitely better for us. I mean, these places, not perfect, and not even close to perfect, evil men. But you could go to the embassy, you could talk to them, you could have conversations with them, and create certain carrots and sticks over time. Even in Libya, them giving up their weapons of mass destruction. Again, that wasn't, we didn't see a ton of fruit from negotiating with those people, but there were certain advantages that we could use to keep those people from attacking, us, right? Certainly they didn't have aspirations to, conduct terrorist attacks in the same way that Al-Qaeda or ISIS does in the United States, even though they had small actions here and there, different things, attempted assassinations, these kind of kooky ideas that never really came to too much fruition other than in their local ambitions. At least they were, large part, they weren't, they at least cared about their lives, if nothing else,
Yeah.
right? And their lifestyle. They didn't want to lose that. So I would say better on like an absolute moral scale. I feel less comfortable about saying that, but better for us, certainly.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Now, I'm not asking this as a gotcha. I'm asking this because I just thought about it. So work with me on this. If we're talking about the evils and as we had just talked about, and that the fact that fewer people likely would have died, if no intervention happened in Iraq in 2003. Would it not also be argued then that if the United States was solely and not solely purely isolationist in 1939, that nobody would have died at Pearl Harbor, and it's quite likely if we didn't intervene against Hitler that Hitler would accuse so many fewer people would have died if we just let Hitler take over Western Europe?
Yeah. So it's harder to make to bring that to World War II because there's a lot of complexities in there that don't exactly line up with intervening in these kind of third countries that we see, right, as opposed to nation state intervention. There was different carrots and sticks at play. First of all, we were working as part of an alliance, right? So when it came to whether we were taking moral responsibility for things and how we saw things ultimately play out, that's an important part of things. We weren't trying to police the world in the sense that we were going to be the sole actor that was going to go into that situation. We were looking at already what was a terrible situation and saying, how can we advance U.S. interests? In both of those cases, we never intervened in Japan and we never intervened in Germany with the intent of minimizing human suffering, right? That was never on the table. It was never,
Right.
we're going to prevent the Holocaust by going into Germany. Never even came up, right? I mean, there was private discussions that were had. Our government was certainly aware of things. We were aware of the atrocities that were being committed in China, but it's just a different set of arguments, right? But why we intervened. Ultimately, I think Roosevelt and his administration saw that there was benefit to, in the long run, to an alliance with Great Britain, and that this was our way of ensuring national power for the future, was to have a more robust involvement in the world war that was already going on at the time, right? And that led us to certain actions with Japan that led us to get, attacked by Japan. And then after that point, it was a defensive war, right? After Japan attacks us, we don't really, we're not entering into it to liberate the people of Japan, right?
Yeah.
So there's a imbalance there in trying to compare going into a country like Iraq versus what we did in World War II. Is that clear?
Yeah, no, it
Yeah.
is. And it's not that I don't believe the same thing. I mean, clearly there are so many different differences between,
Sure.
a unilateral intervention in Iraq in 2003 and Hitler, right? I mean, I don't think there's one person that disagrees, at least today. I mean, there were isolationists back in 1939 who still didn't want to intervene in World War II. But you're hard pressed to find anybody that would say it was a bad idea to go in and defend Europe against Hitler. I get that, but I was trying to tease out the point being made that when the United States intervenes, bad things go wrong and we end up holding on to or becoming responsible for the atrocities that occur. And we shouldn't be just roaming around intervening when it's good for us. But, again, Hitler aside, that's kind of what we did in World War II. I mean, a whole lot of people died in World War II as a result of us getting involved. Many fewer people wouldn't have died if we just let it happen. And the United States would have never gotten involved in World War II if it didn't benefit us. I mean, you said, yes, we were looking for a relationship with Britain because that's good for us. And then it was good for global trade so we can make more money. And then Hitler was bad, which is bad for the United States. So, I don't know. I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here.
It's a good discussion, though. It's an interesting thought, experiment to do. I'm not even sure on the whole whether, especially given the Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe and the things that happened under that, whether, you could necessarily say that unleashing communism in the way that was freed up by not having a Nazi Germany was ultimately led to less people dying. It's a very complicated analysis of what if, right? And but ultimately, I would go back to just like our fundamental motivations for going into that are just very different than like the slate of options that we're given today when looking at do we intervene in such and such country.